Albert was a hard-working man, tilling someone else's soil day in and day out to make a living. The soil of Macon County, Alabama, where he was born and raised, was as much a part of him as his own flesh and blood. When he heard about a new government study promising free medical exams and meals, he was intrigued. After all, who wouldn't want a free checkup in those days, when even a routine doctor's visit was a luxury? Albert was excited, but as years rolled by, he started feeling the pain, the fatigue. He was told it was just bad blood, and he believed it, until he couldn't work anymore. Meanwhile, there was a doctor watching, a doctor who knew he was sick and deliberately made no effort to cure him. In 1932, Macon County, Alabama became the setting for what would later be branded as one of America's most shocking betrayals in medical research. On the surface, the offer seemed benign. Free health care from government health workers for impoverished African American men. Yet behind the promise of special treatment lay an unsettling agenda. The so-called Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro Male was a study that spanned 4 painstaking decades. In this video, we'll expose how its subjects were exploited, knowingly left untreated for syphilis, all under the veneer of science. Going back to 1932, the United States was caught in the clutches of the Great Depression. Poverty was rampant, and for African Americans in the South, options for medical care were scarce to non-existent. Enter the United States Public Health Service, the PHS, promising free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance to impoverished African American men in Macon County, Alabama. On paper, it seemed like a humanitarian endeavor. However, the Tuskegee experiment was anything but. Instead of providing real treatment, researchers were conducting a long-term study on the effects of untreated syphilis. Participants were merely observed, like lab rats in a twisted maze, as their health deteriorated over the years. In the early 1930s, syphilis was a major public health concern, but it was poorly understood. The PHS, eager to study the long-term effects of syphilis, saw an opportunity in Macon County, Alabama. This was a community suffering from poverty, lack of education, and minimal healthcare access. So, what better place for the PHS to explore this debilitating disease? The original intent was supposedly scientific, to understand how syphilis affected the African American population differently, if at all, compared to white Americans. On the surface, it looked like the PHS was bringing much-needed medical attention to a neglected community. However, a darker motive lay beneath the scientific curiosity. Instead of planning a study that could lead to better treatment or a cure, the PHS aimed to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in these men, using their poverty and lack of health care as a backdrop for this twisted human laboratory. The PHS's initial goals were never about healing, but about observing the slow burn of a destructive disease. The men roped into this deceptive study were no different from anyone seeking medical care. They were human beings looking for relief from ailments they didn't fully understand. In total, 600 African American men were involved, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. Most were sharecroppers, men accustomed to toiling in the fields rather than sitting in doctors' offices. They were fathers, brothers, and sons. Lured by promises of special treatment, which included free medical exams, meals, and even burial insurance, enticements that were hard to resist in the depths of the Great Depression. What's heartbreaking is the simplicity of their trust. These were not people familiar with medical jargon or the concept of informed consent. Their understanding was straightforward. Doctors are here to help. That blind faith would be exploited for 40 years, without a single participant ever aware of the life-altering betrayal they were part of. And so, the Tuskegee experiment transformed from a supposed medical initiative into a horrific ethical failure. But what exactly happened behind closed doors? In a nutshell, nothing. At least, nothing beneficial for the participants. Though the study was meant to observe syphilis, the 399 infected men were never told they had the disease. They were deceived into believing they were being treated for bad blood, a term widely used but medically nonspecific. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Effective treatments for syphilis like penicillin became widely available during the course of the study. Yet the researchers deliberately kept this information and the treatment away from their subjects. Why? because curing them would ruin their experiment. Imagine a firefighter watching a house burn just to see how fire consumes wood, while holding a hose in their hand. Syphilis is a bacterial infection usually spread by sexual contact. Left untreated, it can cause severe organ damage and even death. Think of it as a ticking time bomb in the body, silently causing irreversible damage over years or even decades. It was under this shadow that hundreds of men were examined, poked and prodded for 40 years, all while being led to believe they were receiving genuine health care. Their trust was not just betrayed, it was shattered, manipulated into a 4-decade-long ordeal that had devastating consequences. In 1972, Peter Buxton, a former Public Health Service investigator, became the catalyst for the study's unmasking. Hired as a venereal disease investigator by the Public Health Service, it was during his routine work that he stumbled upon the shocking truth of the Tuskegee experiment. Disturbed by the internal reports and medical data he was privy to, Buxton began asking questions, raising concerns within the agency. He was met with a cold shoulder. Frustrated and morally torn, he took his evidence to the press. When the Associated Press broke the story in 1972, public outrage was immediate. Overnight, headlines nationwide spotlighted a shocking tale of ethical betrayal. This was no small leak. It was an explosion that shattered decades of secrecy. Buxton's bravery shattered the wall of secrecy surrounding the study. It was his documentation and willingness to expose the truth that finally led to the study's termination later that same year. In an environment where whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning often face grave consequences, Buxton's decision to expose the unethical experiment serves as a seminal moment in history, spotlighting the eternal conflict between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. The Tuskegee experiment wasn't just a failure of medicine. It was a catastrophic breakdown of ethics on multiple fronts. First, let's talk about informed consent, a cornerstone of ethical medical research. Participants should be fully aware of the research's nature, risks, and benefits. The men in this study were kept in the dark, deceived into thinking they were receiving actual medical care. Then, there's the principle of beneficence, which is fancy talk for do good and prevent harm. The Tuskegee researchers violated this most basic ethical tenet by withholding known treatments for syphilis from the participants. Once penicillin became the standard treatment in the 1940s, the ethical obligation to provide it was clear as day, but was callously ignored. Moreover, the study also raises the thorny issue of exploitation, as it targeted a vulnerable community for its human laboratory. Poverty and lack of education made the men easy targets for manipulation, creating an ethical minefield around issues of social justice and equity. These dilemmas have far-reaching implications. They serve as case studies in medical ethics courses, inspire legislation like the National Research Act, and fuel ongoing debates about how to protect human subjects in research. The Tuskegee experiment isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a framework for examining how badly things can go wrong when ethics are sidelined. The Tuskegee experiment left an indelible scar on American medicine and deeply eroded trust in healthcare, particularly within the African American community. It led to profound changes in research ethics and patient rights. In the immediate aftermath, the National Research Act was enacted in 1974, establishing the requirement for informed consent and ethical review boards. But the legacy doesn't stop with policy changes. The specter of Tuskegee has had long-lasting psychological and cultural impacts. Many African Americans still harbor distrust towards medical institutions, a skepticism with historical roots that can affect healthcare choices today. Think about it. How would you feel about visiting a doctor if you knew your grandfather, uncle, or even neighbor had been exploited in the name of science? Studying the Tuskegee experiment is about understanding how a severe ethical lapse within the healthcare system led to unnecessary suffering for hundreds. Its consequences have rippled through time, affecting minority communities' trust in medical institutions and casting a dark shadow over the ethics of medical research. This isn't merely a case of mistakes were made. We're looking at a fundamental betrayal of trust, a betrayal committed by medical professionals who pledged to do no harm. Let's ensure that the lessons learned from Tuskegee aren't just points on a timeline. but stepping stones towards a more ethical and humane future.